Spinoza is far and away one of the most challenging figures in the Western intellectual tradition. Extremely abstruse, technical, precisionarian. In fact, if any of you have ever looked at his perhaps greatest metaphysical work, the Ethics, you'll note that the very form of it is profoundly, off-putting. It literally takes the form of a geometrical proof with axioms, definitions, scholium, proofs. And I should point out that a lot of them are, well, sort of fanciful, not quite accurate. And I'm not going to try and go through all of the proofs with you in any entirety. What I will try to do is, again, try and make them intuitively clear to you and go over some of the central metaphysical doctrines. But that's not the only sense in which Descartes is difficult or challenging. He's challenging in the most obvious sense. Spinoza, perhaps unlike any other philosopher, perhaps up to the time of Nietzsche, challenges the received wisdom of the Western view. We saw even with Descartes, who was certainly the father of modern philosophy, that he accepted the notion of God and the notion of human freedom, free will. Not so with Spinoza. With Spinoza, we see one of the first purely rational, skeptical minds. Yet at the same time, a rational mind that is attuned to the needs of the human spirit. And therefore, I want to ask you to try and suspend whatever prejudices you may have towards Spinoza's views and follow along and see if there's not something perhaps in it that appeals to you. I should point out he's not only challenging to us today, he was incredibly challenging to his environment. In fact, he was excommunicated from both his own faith, the Jewish religion, and from the Christian faith. And that is no small trick. I mean, you must really be doing something right if everyone hates you. And yet people who knew him, and one of which was the famous philosopher Leibniz, said he was an absolutely charming man. Sweet, kind, considerate, in many ways nurturant. And yet he was vilified. If you read in, say, 17th or 18th century philosophy, many figures will mention him as a horrible, evil man. And again, from a certain perspective, he may seem that way. But I think if you take the larger view, you can't help but see that that is fundamentally a statement of ignorance and prejudice. Let me begin with some of the problematic, challenging ideas he suggests towards what I'd call the Judeo-Christian tradition. And again, that's the idea that there is, in the sky somewhere, a God who created the world and cares about it. Spinoza's reaction in the 17th century, writing after Descartes, he was profoundly influenced by Descartes. They lived in the same city, in fact, Amsterdam, was one of bemusement and occasionally, perhaps, something close to disgust. His point was that once upon a time, to believe there was a great sky daddy, very much like our tribal chieftain, who tells us what to do and give him blood libations and sacrifices and love him with all our heart. Once upon a time, that was not such a crazy idea. Right? When nature was a mystery, when all we looked at the world with was with awe, at that moment, it was acceptable to believe in myth, to believe in God. But he says now that we have modern science, now that we're at the very cusp of the Newtonian revolution, and he was extremely scientifically literate. In fact, to digress for one moment, there is a great myth about Spinoza, that he was a lens grinder. It's got a germ of truth to it. He ground lenses, but not for glasses. He was independently wealthy, came from a Jewish merchant family, set himself up in business at a very young age, and made himself independently wealthy. He was grinding lenses because he was doing experiments in optics and doing foundational research using microscopes and telescopes. So his point is, given our modern scientific knowledge of the world, how can we believe that somewhere, if we could just get beyond, say, Saturn or something like that, and open a door, we'd find ourselves in heaven, where there's this tyrant who pushes us around? And he says, even if you did believe in some kind of a God, why would he care about you? Do you think this is the only planet in the universe? Right? He's post-Copernican. He realizes that the Earth's not the center of the universe. There are other planets. There may be other life forms. that was a position that was very challenging. He was accused of atheism. I'm going to argue, in fact, he's not an atheist. That he only appears to be an atheist if we are traditional Judeo-Christians. One of the critiques that was thrown at him was that he denied spirituality. I don't think so. I think he attempts to offer us a scientific spirituality. A spirituality, as it were, for a rational person in the 20th century. A sense of the beauty and perhaps sublimity of the world without having to believe things which at least Spinoza thought would make a gorilla blush. Right? Okay. The other thing he rejected, and it's from Aristotle, and it's closely connected to the Judeo-Christian tradition, was the notion of teleology. Right? As I previously mentioned with Aristotle, teleology is the notion that the earth has purposes, things have purposes, natural end states. Now, again, Spinoza says, once upon a time, I could see how that idea got born. How? Primitive man creates tools. And tools are purposeful, aren't they? Right? A hammer is very good for the purpose of driving nails. A knife is very good for the purpose of cutting. And from a primitive perspective, it was an understandable leap to see that if there were things in nature naturally occurring that served our purposes, therefore there must be some sort of tool maker who created them. Right? Food just happens to serve our purposes. But his point is that once upon a time, that was an acceptable view. But in a modern scientific age, can we really believe nature has a purpose? That it's moving towards something? It's an incredible sort of hubris to think that, well, nature's purpose, of course, is to supply us with things to eat and things to dominate. Incredibly hubris because it implies that somehow or other the cosmos came about to serve my particular purposes. And that he finds palpably absurd. There's no intelligence behind the world. The world is a physical phenomenon. There's no purpose behind it. There's no end of it. If the world went out of being tomorrow, got exploded in a huge series of nuclear accidents, that would happen. Nothing would be lost. It's not some cosmic tragedy. Right? There's no purpose to be fulfilled. It's simply the physical substance of the universe, or however we want to describe that substance, we'll see that becomes controversial, working itself out through the causal nexus. So we must remove animism, purpose, and notions of divine intent, or perhaps anthropomorphic natural intent from the world. When we speak of natural law, we must not think of it as human law and as moral necessity. We must think of it as mathematical law, as logical necessity, not having any normative value. And the implications, for instance, in terms of ethics, are profound. If we are, as it were, simply in nature, then we have to see that all human action is part of the natural economy of things. War as well as peace. Hatred as well as love. And that they are all completely logically understandable and scientifically explainable phenomena. Okay, so much for Spinoza's critiques of what preceded him. As I mentioned, Spinoza is profoundly affected by Descartes' epistemology. That is the epistemology of clear and distinct ideas, and the method of carefully, rationally reconstructing one's arguments. That is, in fact, the reason why the work takes the form of a geometric proof in 5 books. He's basically trying to say, look, René, if you really took your ideas seriously, you would not have written expository prose. Whereas once upon a time, expository prose, with the Milesians, as I argued, was a great breakthrough, we've reached the point now where that too is antiquated. The only forms of disputation which are acceptable are logical, mathematical proofs. He also accepted something else from Descartes at face value, and that was his definition of substance. And remember, we saw 2 substances, mind and body. What they both had in common was, for Descartes, a propensity to exist. Right? That's what a substance is, that which has a propensity to existence. Well, if that's what substance is it logically possible that there would be more than one of them? Right? Why should then one posit that there are 2 distinct substances? It would make more sense, since unity and simplicity is the basic axiom of the scientific method, to see what we can do by arguing that, in fact, there's really only one substance. And that is, of course, the world and the universe. That position, by the way, is called metaphysical monism. Monism meaning one. There's only one thing. And it's generally the famous contrast to Descartes' metaphysical dualism. In this case, it was a dualism of mind and body. What's interesting about Spinoza is that he refers to that substance as God or nature. That's the question. Why would he do that? Was it an attempt to get into religious good graces? I don't think so. He'd been excommunicated, and incidentally, I should point out, he didn't exactly try to avoid excommunication. Once he'd realized the fruits of his own researches, he thought it was a very good idea to lie down in front of the synagogue on the Sabbath, so that if these people really felt they had to go in and pray, they should do it over his body to realize how much contempt he had for them. No, I don't think it was to avoid ecclesiastical censure. If it was completely unsuccessful. Rather, it's his attempt to offer a rational spirituality. If there's no God in heaven, then why not take that sense of wonderment, of awe, of reverence, and simply apply it to being, to that which exists? And it is a very, not only rational, but in many ways humanistic sort of religion, isn't it? I mean, commonly called pantheism. But it's rather that simply because we don't believe in the Judeo-Christian myths, there's no reason to give up on human spirituality. It's an essential part of the well-lived life. One can rationally feel that take those same feelings and simply apply it to being itself, to whatever exists. One can reverence life. One can reverence the ways of nature or God. Well, if there's only one substance, then how do we deal with the apparent fact that I've got a body and I've got a mind? That there's something different in me than in chimpanzees. Right? We do seem to all have that intuition that the mind is distinct from the body. That can't be so if there's monism. What Spinoza argues is, rather than think of them as two different substances, think of them as the same thing, but described in two different ways. He calls them attributes. Well, fair enough, but how would you cash that in? You might cash it in this way. Isn't it true that when an event occurs, we can describe it in many different ways? For instance, for those of you who play chess, know that there's a chess notation. Imagine then, I'm going to tell you two moves in a chess game. White plays pawn to king 4, black plays knight to king bishop 3. That's a description of an event, right? That notation, pk4, nkb3. That's one description. But that's not a complete description. I could describe it differently. I could describe it rather than in terms of the logical notation of chess, in physical terms, biological terms. One human lifts his right hand, picks up a piece of matter, moves it forward 2 inches, and places it down. Another, directly opposite to him, picks up a different piece of matter, moves it 2 inches forward, and 1 inch to the left. Two different things, exact same event, described differently. And we could add more descriptions, different sorts of descriptions, to get different aspects of it, different attributes. We could say that was Bobby Fischer playing Eliafim's defense against Boris Spassky. And that is, in fact, the opening. We could even make it richer than that and say what was really going on there. Don't describe it in terms of chess notation, physicality, or the fact of the chess match. What was really going on there was a psychological thing. Bobby Fischer psyched his shoes off of Boris Spassky. He played that opening 6 months before in Buenos Aires against Spassky, and had his head ripped off. And here he is in the international championship, playing that move, clearly unsound, and saying, yeah, I'm not real afraid of you, Boris. And at that moment, from on in, Spassky's second best. He just loses his nerve. So we can describe that event in a lot of different ways. And he responds to Descartes, it's not a lot of different events, it's the same thing, you're just describing it differently. So we can describe, then, human action in two ways. We can describe it physically as the motion of organs, neural firings, or we can describe it in terms of a distinct linguistic protocol, a distinct descriptive way or way of analysis, and that is in terms of ideas. But there's no reason to assume, because we have two different ways of talking about the same thing, that they're not the same thing. That is, hence, his monism. Now, I should add another point to that. He actually said that we're only aware of these two attributes, body and mind. In addition to which, he said, there's undoubtedly an infinite number of those attributes. Why? Beats me. It has something to do with the notion that since God is, in fact, substance, and God is perfect in some sense, we reverence it, and being is complete, it would probably have an infinite number of attributes. Now, that's real abstruse. The way I try to make that intuitive is to say, Spinoza, in ways, is a sort of proto-hippie. You know, he's saying, wow, man, you know, God's like so many different kinds of things, we can't conceptualize it, you know. You know, maybe he's a California hippie, I'm sorry, in that regard, if you're from California. But the key for us, I think what we should try and take from Spinoza, because that is a sort of bizarre doctrine, is that notion that the mind and body may not in fact be distinct things at all. They may in fact be, and Spinoza argued, I think quite cogently, are just two different ways of describing the same phenomenon. Now, let me be clear about something. Not all of nature can be described in terms of mind, right? I wouldn't describe the movement of, say, a chair in terms of the will of the chair or the concepts that the chair has. The only part of nature that could be described in terms of mind is, of course, humans. So therefore, that leads us to the following question. Does God have a mind? Yes, he does. And where is that mind? It's in all of you and in me. Because there is no God outside of us and nature. So the mind of God that goes through a sort of process of development, perhaps, and we'll see something quite like this in Hegel, is in fact human rationality, the human speculative insight, the human mind, which is the same thing as the human body. And hence, his metaphysical monism and resolution of the mind-body problem. Now, another thing I want to point out, if it is the case that we accept Descartes' clear and distinct epistemology and realize that such ideas, clear and distinct ones, are intuitively true and therefore correspond to objective reality, then we can conclude that the causal nexus, what exists in the world as the glue between entities, is identical to what, in terms of the description of ideas, would be called logical necessity. It's an abstruse doctrine, but has very important implications. Why? Because if it's true that every cause, and we agree that everything in the universe is caused, right? There's nothing that's uncaused. If every cause is assimilable to logical necessity, to logical implication, then every cause is necessary. There's no accidents. Therefore, the universe knows no spontaneity, knows no accidents, knows no chance, knows no fortune. Those are all words based on our ignorance. We may not be able to explain a phenomena, but it's completely logically determined. And therefore, everything that happens and will happen is unavoidable. And that doctrine is called determinism. So in Spinoza, we find the expression of monistic determinism. There's one thing that makes up being, and that is substance, God, or nature. And its behavior is completely determined. There's no accidents, no chances. And that raises the other sense in which, or another way in which Spinoza is quite controversial and challenging. For he says, and you, are you a part of nature? Are you an animal, or are you a ghost in a machine like Descartes thought? Somehow different than monkeys and chimpanzees. Well, you're different in that you're much more complex. And you can speak and reason, and we can describe you in terms of ideas. But surely man is part of nature. And if man is part of nature, then his behavior too is determinable, is predictable. In fact, if that's the case, then the notion of free will is a pathetic joke. We don't have free will. We are completely determined by our education, our sensory inputs, the sort of training we've had in making inferences. And again, I realize that that's a very counterintuitive notion. We do feel like we make choices all the time. But what Spinoza asks us is, and those choices, I suppose they were random? Nothing determined that choice, right? Well then, if there was something that determined that choice, then they're caused, and hence determined and predictable. If there was nothing that determined it, and it was random, then it was, well, irrational. Now, again, abstract. Let me try and cash it in a common sense example. We all believe we have free will. Yet somehow or other, we do feel we can predict other people's behavior. And the two things don't mesh. How do we predict other people's behavior? I presume not only how many of you, most of you have seen Marx Brothers movies, right? I really love them. And there's a wonderful demonstration of determinism there, because there's a counterexample to it. You ever notice whenever you try to shake, whenever someone tries to shake Harpo Marx's hand, what he does? He sticks his knee in it, right? Well, what's the point? When you meet someone for the first time and you stick your hand out, if they have completely free will and their action is unpredictable, it shouldn't shock you at all that they stick their knee in it. You should be surprised if they don't stick their elbow in it. Perhaps rub their nose in your hand. Why not? But somehow or other, you really do seem to have the sense that they're going to stick their hand out and grasp yours. Hence, you believe their behavior is predictable. Hence, you believe it's determined by your own action. If we've watched children, watched them grow up, don't you feel you can predict their responses to things? Right? If you've got a kid that, say, loves the Redskins, you know, he's a big football fan, and you know how the Super Bowl is going to end up, you know, you watch the Super Bowl, can't you predict he's going to be real happy at the end? Well, how can you predict that if his behavior is not determined, if it's not a stimulus-response game with respect to his desires? That's the intuition that Spinoza tries to give you. He tries to tell you, look, we may not understand all of the causes of our action. That's no reason to assume they're uncaused. We once didn't understand the cause of gravitational attraction or what it was, how we could predict it. That didn't mean that things fell to the earth, as Aristotle said, because they love them, because they kind of feel natural on the earth. Right? That's an argument from ignorance. And he argues that the more you come to understand a person, the more data you have, the more you can predict them. And I think we all see that in our common life, right? I mean, people you know very well, you know how they're going to respond to a question. You know what they're going to do in a certain situation. And when they don't, is it because, well, they have free will, or because there was probably some mitigating circumstance which you didn't know? If you had all of the complete biography, you would be able to predict everything, and all of the complete neurology, of course. That's exactly what Spinoza tries to give us. A modern determinist psychology. I'm not going to run through the whole thing, but I'll tell you he posits two principles, and from them is able to produce in a logical deduction all of the emotional states we have. So, what is the first posit? Something he calls the conatus. He says within every organic entity is a desire for survival, a will to power, if you will, an élan vital. Or, as we Darwinians might say, a survival instinct, right? Everything attempts to have as much potency as it possibly can in its environment. That's what it means to be alive, to be animate matter. So we start with that, the conatus. Will to life, desire. And we add one more principle, which Spinoza invented, and which is the basis of all modern psychology, the principle of association. All right? If Redskin victories are associated in the young child's mind with, or experience with pleasure, with going out to McDonald's afterwards if it likes McDonald's, or getting a Slurpee afterwards if it likes Slurpees. After that, every time the Redskins win, it will be experienced as pleasant. Those two things will be associated together. We know that with dogs, from Pavlov. You ring a bell before you feed it, and after a while, if you ring a bell, you don't even have to bring the food, it starts drooling. And we know that with humans too, right? We have associations, and unraveling them is the business of modern psychologists when they become traumatic. With that, he's able to argue that every emotional response we have, every emotional state, is simply principle of association with a desire for pleasure, pain, or to avoid pain, and can be reconstructed from that. So love is an association we have with something which is positive, which is pleasant to us, and the idea of the thing which causes it. And he goes on and with all the inverses. I'm not going to go through the whole proofs with you, but my point is he's reducing all of human psychology to stimulus and response, which is exactly what you would do with animal psychology too, isn't it? And his point is, well, that's just what you'd expect. What are you after all? You're an animal too. Why shouldn't you obey all the rest of the laws of biology? Right? And in fact, think about stimulus response. How do you train a dog? How do you housebreak a dog? Stimulus and response. How do you train a child? Stimulus and response. When a child goes to stick his hand in the fire, do you reason with him? If you do that, you're going to, get nerve damage there, and it's going to cause very unpleasant neural states. Or do you say, no, that's bad, and he feels shame? And he associates sticking his hand in the fire with a state of shame, and he avoids it. And then later on, when he gets old, you'll say, well, the reason I did that, I didn't mean to really, traumatize you or anything, but I didn't want you to burn your hand. And that, he says, is the nature in a very complex way of human emotionality. Now, we turn now to his doctrine, his way of salvation. And it's a difficult way. He says as much, but I think it's important. He argues that what is human happiness? What is the well-being of the human? And not in some abstract and metaphysical way, but palpably. It's the well-being of the animal. What makes an animal, or gives it more well-being? More power, right? Quite simply, the more power, the more potency it has, the better off it is. In physical terms, that means strength, stature, to have all of the best physical development possible. And emotionally, there's an analog to it. So happiness is creating as much power for yourself as possible. Now, here's where he says something interesting. If you are determined in your cognitive states by external phenomena, and they overwhelm you, does that make you more powerful or less powerful? In other words, if, say, the amount of taxes you have to pay is going to make you depressed for 3 weeks, then vis-a-vis your environment, is that a state of empowerment or disempowerment? It's disempowerment. Your cognitive states, your emotional life, is being determined by something outside of you. That's a lack of power. He describes that as a passive emotion. Passive in the sense that you are held passive to external phenomena that manipulate the way you're going to feel about your life. And that's the only thing of which you're immediately aware are your feelings. So your life is, in fact, out of your hands insofar as you succumb to passive emotions, insofar as you are simply a response to stimulus. In fact, he goes farther, and I think quite eloquently, I want to read you a small passage, describes that as human bondage. I assign the term bondage to man's lack of power to control and check the emotions. For a man at the mercy of his emotions is not his own master, but is subject to fortune, in whose power he lies so that he is often compelled, although he sees the better course, to pursue the worse. Insofar as emotion, caused by external phenomena, grip our cognitive states, our consciousness, we are in the grasp of things outside of us. We are determined by that which is outside of us. This is the origin of a notion called heteronomy, which will become one of the fundamental principles of Kant's metaphysics of morals. And he points out something. We're all in human bondage. No one can avoid all of emotional bondage. And that's where he differs from the Stoics. He says the Stoics, they had a good idea, but no one can actually achieve what the Stoics achieve. But he says there is a way out, a way of salvation. It's not absolute. It's not complete. But nonetheless, it at least gives us a chance to reach the path of salvation. And that is, how do you break the power of the emotions over you? It's by understanding the cause. By learning scientifically how human psychology is a stimulus and response game. When you do that, when you see the necessity of all of your emotional states, of all of your judgments, they, as it were, lose their power on you. Now, it may not seem obvious to any of us how that should be the case. But in fact, think about what modern psychologists do. How they do break people from traumas and emotional bondages. They simply explain how they occurred. And that's the form of therapy. It's a sort of speech therapy. Once you understand the nature of the things which are causing your responses, you are sort of therapeutically liberated. You can then look at that emotional state as I get my taxes, fill out my tax bill and realize I have to pay a lot of money, and immediately start to feel rage and anger. I can say to myself, but Darren, that's a completely understandable and predictable response to the fact that, you want to keep as much money in your pocket as you possibly can. And once I realize that, the power of that powerful emotion is checked. And I can sort of say, yeah, it was funny that I would have been upset about that, but now I can achieve a certain degree of equanimity, of serenity, of equipoise towards the world. So when you come to understand the necessity of each of your human emotions, why you must have stimulus-response patterns, then you are, strangely enough, able to liberate yourself from that power. That also means, however, you have to understand the necessity of events in the world. And this bears on Spinoza's life in a very, I think, important way. Here is a man who's been excommunicated from the Jewish and Christian faith. In addition to which, he's been vilified by all speculators. He comes from a tradition, Sephardic Judaism, which has recently gone through about a century of brutal persecution in the Iberian Peninsula. In fact, he's originally from Portugal, pushed out from the Spanish Inquisition. Wouldn't it be natural to be bitter and angry in that sort of a situation? To look around at your, perhaps, the Christian environment that surrounds you and say, man, I hate these people. They're hateful. They're sick. All they do is persecute. They supposedly teach a doctrine of love. But Spinoza's point is, yeah, you could do that. That would be an understandable emotional response, and you'd live a life of misery, a life of bitterness. What you have to do is understand they're acting just the way people would if they'd had the upbringing they've had, the training they've had, the moral indoctrination they've had. It's completely understandable that they'd act that way. They're not to be blamed for it. It doesn't hurt the universe. So they persecute me in Portugal and send me, from Lisbon to Amsterdam and persecute me there too. I'm not the end of the world. That's what people do sometimes. Sometimes they do nice things, sometimes they do unnice things. There's no point in railing against it. It's not going to change it. The only thing you can control, to some extent, and again, very much like Marcus Aurelius, are your own emotional states, is your own state of mind. And if that's what you can control, then even in the midst of persecution, of excommunication, you can remain, as Spinoza did, a charming, kind, friendly person. Even as you're being vilified and told that you're a pig and an atheist, you can smile and say, I understand why you think that. I disagree, but I'm not angry with you. If I'd been brought up like you were brought up, if I'd thought the thoughts that you think, I'd undoubtedly agree with you. I'd like you to try and see it my way. But if you don't, if you in fact decide to kill me as a result, there's nothing I can do, and I'm not going to be upset about it. I have as much time as I have, and I'm going to enjoy it in equipoise, equanimity, and in peace. Here's a step farther, however. Once you realize the necessity of everything in the universe, then hatred disappears. And you can return to that reverence for being, even in the midst of the most awkward and unhappy circumstances. And that then takes the form of a sort of universal rational love. You realize that the universe is just the way it is, and it's the way it has to be, given the laws of nature. And you get old and die, and that's the way it should be. Some people get disease, but hey, someone's got to feed microparasites. That's the way of the world. And if you can do that, then with each thing that happens, you can look at it and say, it's necessary. It may not seem pleasant, but there's no reason to let it upset me. That's the way the universe is. There's no reason to let it disturb the tranquility of a rational intellect. And in fact, we realize that the ultimate sort of power you have, when no longer can anything outside of you control your emotional states, the ultimate expression of that power is the ability to love everyone and everything, even your enemies. To say, I have so much power over you that even when you tell me that I'm a horrible lecturer, I still like you because you can't get me upset, because I understand that I just do the best I can. And if that's not particularly good, it's still the best I can. And that's the only standard I can judge myself by. And so if you think that's horrifically bad, I respect that, and that's fine. That's the standard that Spinoza offers us. It's a particularly modern, I would say, sort of spirituality, particularly beautiful spirituality. It's not to say that it's been invented in modernity. I think the Stoics launched something very close, and clearly it's not very far from what the Buddha teaches. But it's modern in another sense. If we are to have a spirituality today, and we are not to do violence to our spiritual needs, to our scientific understanding of the world, if we're not to come up with some contradiction, I wonder if Spinoza's is not the last sort of religion that a scientific and rational person could have. And it's an important point Spinoza makes in arguing that this is a way of salvation. Because what he's stating is spirituality is a real part of human life. We always thought it referred to something transcendental, but simply because we don't believe in the transcendental anymore, there's no reason to give up the spirituality. That's the baby in the bathwater problem. All we have to do is take that sense of awe, that sense of reverence, and apply it to the world, and perhaps to each other. That, he sees, is the way of liberation. So then, in conclusion, I want to, as it were, append something to a previous lecture. Professor Segru mentioned that Stoicism, or the sort of ethos, which is very similar to what Spinoza argues for, is particularly apt for military men, for what he calls silver men, men of spirit. And I think that that's a very good point. I think he's right. But it's also very apt for another sort of person. It's apt for another sort of time. Unfortunately, one of the dark sides of modernity has been persecution, has been intolerance, has been destruction. In such moments, when the world seems most bleak, what are one's options? To rail? To scream? To cry? You've only got a short time to live. You might as well not waste it. It's for people in such a position, with their, quote, backs against the wall, that Spinoza's philosophy is indeed a way of salvation. Since you're only going to be alive as long as you're going to be alive. And if you're going to be hated and vilified, why not find a spirituality which allows you to keep your sense of equipoise, your sense of happiness intact? To live a full and rich life in the worst of circumstances. And I would enjoin that perhaps not for Americans, we've been fortunate, but for peoples around the world, peoples who lived through the nightmares of the Second World War, the hideous repression that existed in the Soviet Union, existed in communist China, still exists in communist China, existed in Pol Pot's Cambodia. If you are to emerge from that without being permanently scarred, without being completely, and even contemplate it, without being completely distraught and made ill at ease in the world, feeling like you want to commit suicide, that's the moment to think of Spinoza. And to think of how this man, in very similar circumstances, could live a life of dignity, of compassion, of love, and even toward those who persecuted him. How he could emerge from such trials intact. So in short, I do think that Spinoza offers us a legitimate path towards salvation.